right, so this is our third week where we're bringing our topic up to the modern period. And if you recall, last time I talked about how the medieval idea about prophetic responsibility developed, first with this incident in which the Bishop of Milan challenged the emperor because of his unjust acts, and then with some political theorizing by Augustine about how we need to dwell in always in a city of God, not in the earthly cities that we live in, and then how that developed in various different ways, with the ending with the fact that the monastic movement, particularly the mendicant monastic movement, started to shift and say, well, we need to critique not just people in power, but we need to critique systems, economic systems. So, but that is living in a world where, when we're living in the pre-Reformation world, we're living in a world where there's one church that has a responsibility or a relationship with power. But the Reformation breaks apart that agreement, and we get a lot of conversation and a lot of debate beginning in the 16th century. So I want to talk a little bit about the how some of the key ideas in the Reformation, how they originally fed into democratizing the notion of prophetic responsibility. It's not the responsibility of just priests and monks to speak truth to power, to corruption, and to evil in our societies, but it's the responsibility of everybody. So I want to talk about those ideas, and then talk about how people wanted to take it a little bit further. And then finally, I'm going to bring us up to my modern example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And then I'm going to end in a place that I would not have known that I was going to end last Sunday, because I just saw something on modern TV, which was very heartwarming, and which exactly what we're talking about was on the Colbert Show. So it's at the end. I quoted the whole thing for you at the end, so you can see that, and you can go watch the Colbert clip later on today. Keep your tip. Okay, so if you look at the Reformation basically smashes the Catholic consensus, and there's lots of issues that are going on, but one of the central claims starts to be sola scriptura. Now, we all know this. Protestants know this, that this is one of the main claims, that authority does not reside in human beings, in special human beings. In fact, there aren't any special human beings. That's the next part, right? But authority does not reside in special human beings. Responsibility does not reside there. It's only in Scripture. So only Scripture can critique power. Only the ideas that we draw from Scripture. We can't just be relying on monks and priests. So Luther said, my conscience is captive to the word of God. That needs to be the measure. Scripture needs to be the measure against which we are evaluating and critiquing society. And then the next aspect of it was the idea that we are all the priesthood of all believers. This is this radical democratization, right? So it's not the case that prophets and monks are special. It's not the case that prophets and monks have all the power and the authority. That's not true. But the flip side of that coin is they also do not have all the responsibility. They don't have all the power, and they don't also don't have all the responsibility. All people have the same power. All people have the same responsibility. So prophetic responsibility now belongs to regular Christians. And that links up with the notion of vocation, right? It used to be the case that, people would have a special vocation to become a priest, a special vocation. Hi, Anne, to become a monk, to be called to the religious life. People would have this special vocation. Well, now that idea, once the priesthood of all believers becomes democratized, the idea of vocation becomes democratized, right? So if you are a farmer, you can nevertheless, right, live the gospel, preach the gospel as a farmer, as a merchant, as a householder. So then you have to think, well, how can I have to make a living. I have to live in this world. So it's not going to be just my job to engage with matters of the church, but your whole life then right, should become a kind of vocation, even if you are an artist or a dancer or a banker or whatever it is that you're doing in your life. So everybody has to get, we have to show faithfulness in the everyday structures of life. So this notion of vocation develops. So these are ideas that emerge in the initial stages of the Reformation, right? We don't need to look, we have the responsibility to live as Christians. We are like priests. We also have this responsibility to critique. So that becomes one of the key ideas in the Protestant Reformation, that it's the responsibility of all of us, not just your minister, not just your pastor. It's the responsibility of all of us to critique unjust systems. That's one strand that develops out of the Protestant Reformation. The next thing that happens is there's another stage to the Reformation, and these groups are general, and this is again back in the 1500s and 1600s, and this is what's sometimes called the Radical Reformation, the Radical Reformation. And the people who are the radical reformers, we start seeing that what they're saying is, if the Sermon on the Mount is true, why does the church still look like the empire? Why do we not look any different than everybody else? We look just like empire. We're just as obsessed with money, structures of power. You can't tell who we are by looking at us and by looking at how we live. Hello, good morning. Is there one down there, Anne, for
Yes.
our new visitor? Okay, great, thanks.
Yep.
Welcome. So why are Christians, why are we indistinguishable? Why are we still killing for the state, swearing oaths to political powers that we, right? The earliest Christians were like, I can't swear an oath to the emperor, right? So why are we doing that? Why are we doing all of these things? Why are we even using force to coerce people into belief? Why are we hoarding wealth? Why are we doing all these things, right? If Jesus, right, we need to take seriously scripture. Jesus said, love your enemies. Right? If somebody brings violence to your step, you need to slaps you, hurts you, you need to turn the other cheek, right? You need to not meet violence with violence. We're not supposed to be just a Christian version of empire. That's not what we're supposed to be. And this is an important thing. This idea is important as we are living in a time where Christian nationalism is on the rise. Right, the radical reformers were not interested in making empire Christian. They were interested in making the church Christian as a radical alternative to empire. Right, we need to be, just like Augustine says, we may be dwelling, and just like the Gospel of John says, we're dwelling in the world, but we're not of the world. We need to, our community, the answer is not, okay, well, we're going to become all powerful, right? The Holy Roman Empire. We're going to become all powerful. No. Right? We are trying to show that there are alternatives to power seeking, to violence, to coercion, to force, to wealth hoarding. We need to be a visible alternative of that. And so we're not supposed to. So what ends up happening is in 1527, there's a small group of these radical reformers, and they meet in a little Swiss village, and they write a basic document. It's called I don't know how to say the name of this town, Schlettheim Confession. And it's basically a blueprint for saying we need to live as a completely different kind of society. Hold on, I realized I don't have my phone out, so I'm not going to know how long I'm going. Okay, we need to live in a completely different society. And they had essentially two ideas. They had many ideas, but like don't swear oaths, but two that I think are important for us. Number one, violence and power, right? It was commonplace to force people through inquisitions, through social coercion, through conquest, right? To force people to become believers, to force people to become Christians. This is commonplace in antiquity, in the ancient world, and in the medieval world. This is commonplace. And they say, no, right? The coercion and power, right? These are elements of the state. We are not called to use the tools of the state in our community, right? We need to, we live as a Christian community, and people obviously see that this is a better, more ethical, more loving, more humane way, more godly way of living. So we don't want to use the tools of the state. So pacifism and resistance to any form of violence or coercion or force becomes central to the vision of the radical performers or radical reformers. Then the second one, so they refuse violence. And the second reason is they take very seriously the portrait of the economic life of the church and the economic theology of Jesus. If you look in the book of Acts, the earliest community, they hold all things in common. And there's kind of a funny story where there's one person who's like, well, because you have to give all your property to the community. And there's one guy who's like, well, I don't want to give everything, right? So he holds a little bit back and he gets struck dead. So that's kind of an amusing story. But the point is the radical reformers took this seriously, that they wanted to live in intentional community and share all things, right? So it's not just, the gospel is not something you believe, it's something you live. That's what the radical reformers wanted people to understand. This is not just a set of intellectual ideas to which we give assent. That is not what's happening, right? So what should be happening is that we are simply living the gospel life and living in community. And so they take seriously that portrait in the book of Acts about developing an alternative community. And you see this idea again from the very beginning. In the book of Revelation, there's a contrast between the city of Babylon and the city of God, right? We're to come out of that city. What is that city characterized? Violence, economic exploitative activity. Revelations 18, it just lists economic trafficking in goods, in order to make money, trafficking in human beings in order to make money, all this kind of stuff. And we are called to come out of that city of Babylon, which is really Rome, which is really just earthly cities, and to move into the city of God, right? Which is one that's welcome. There's no gates. It's welcoming. It's open to all. Food, medicine, explicitly these things, food, medicine are all free. They're all available to everybody on Agoros without silver, right? And so then this idea of two cities comes up again in Augustine, right? The city of God. No earthly city is adequate, right? And he's meaning by city of community. No earthly community is adequate. We need to live in the city of God, although we're living here on earth. Well, that's what the radical reformers said, that they go back to this notion. So the church itself then, simply by the way that it lives, functions as a prophetic critique of corrupt systems of power and wealth hoarding and violence, simply by being a visible alternative to that way of living. So the radical reformers, again, they're not trying to make the empire Christian. They are not trying to do that. They want to make the church Christian, right? And they want to remind people that the gospel calls us to create a new kind of social reality in the midst of the old one, right? That Jesus calls us to be partners in transforming the world ourselves. We're not supposed to. One of the fascinating things is if you compare Jesus and John the Baptist, their messages are very similar, with a major distinction. John the Baptist has gone out to the desert. He's waiting there for the kingdom of God to come. Right. And Jesus is connected to that movement at the beginning, and he leaves and he begins his own movement. And he basically says, we're not just waiting, we are called to transform the world now while we're waiting for the world to be transformed by God. So in the Reformation, then, what we see then are a crystallization of these two main ways that we can embody prophetic responsibility, prophetic critique, and a blueprint for prophetic activism. So basically the Christian duty to resist unjust systems, right? That's that medieval prophetic responsibility, now democratized. We all should feel empowered to do that. And then create that your church community should be explicitly a visible alternative that looks different, distinctive from the use of power and wealth hoarding in society. Those are the two major streams. So how did this kind of manifest itself in culture. And you can see this in a couple ways, a couple examples, and then the last example that I'll be talking about will be the Dietrich Bonhoeffer piece. So one example that I'm sure we're all familiar with is the abolitionist movement. If you think about the abolitionists, this is an obvious topic anyway, but my dad, who was a professor of American Studies, he studied the people who were come to be called the theologians of the abolitionist movement, which is the Beecher family. And most people know Harriet Beecher Stowe, but it was her who's the novelist of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And apocryphally, Lincoln said to her, I'm so happy to meet the little woman who started the Civil War, right? Because through the storytelling, she was able to elicit a compassionate response to the fate of enslaved people. So, but her brothers, they are the theologians of the abolitionist movement, and they were very clear that they needed to use the gospel to critique these unjust systems of enslavement, that this is a system that is incompatible with the gospels. So the Beecher Stowe family is an example of people who are speaking truth to power. They're using the gospel to deconstruct these systems, these economic and social systems of enslavement. You see that with Frederick Douglass too, who says he distinguishes, who's close to us, he distinguishes between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land, right? National Christianity, Christianity that's connected to ideals of nationhood, Christianity as it's happening in the land in America during times of slavery. That is not the Christianity of Christ, right? We need to make a distinction. Christians are not looking distinct enough. They're not being, you can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference between them. Another example is across the pond, William Wilberforce famously spent his life attacking the British slave trade. And again, basically saying this is not just an issue of an individual slaveholders being bad people, right? This is a system of economic and social power. Right, that is what needs to be critiqued, not individual slave owners, although of course they're problematic, but the whole system that we have allowed, right? That in and of itself means that Britain and the British Empire at that time cannot conceptualize itself as a Christian society. The church needs to be a visible alternative to that. You also see that in the Catholic development of the social gospel. And you start to have people at once, we deal with slavery, then we have the Industrial Revolution, and Protestant Christians and Catholic Christians began to apply the same logic to industrial capitalism. What does it mean to love your neighbor in a world of child labor, tenement, slum housing, starvation wages, vast concentrations of wealth? With the Industrial Revolution, we just start to get massive concentration of robber barons, the Gilded Age, right? We all know all of that, right? And that is built on the backs of children. Like whole families could all be working 18-hour days and still be mired in poverty. How can that possibly be? People that have multiple jobs, whole families working constantly, and they still be mired in poverty. So this becomes, again, for the social gospel, this becomes a major point of critique. And again, Walter Rauschenberg, he says, sin is not only in individuals, but in social systems, right? It's not enough to critique individual people, right? Just like people are saying, it's not enough to critique somebody like the current president, right? We have to critique the system that allows him to flourish. That is the issue. That is the problem, not the single individual slave owner, not the single individual robber baron, not the single individual billionaire, but how have we tolerated a system and not been engaged as Christians in a critique of a system with so much concentration of wealth and power that is consistently being used to exploit other people? In this modern civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, famously in his letter from the Birmingham jail, he basically argued that the problem is not just the violent oppressor, it is the silent moderate church, right? And I'm sure you've heard that many, many times, right? People who are good Christians, who are not participating in the violence, but neither are they resisting it, right? They don't see that as their responsibility. And so it's not enough, right, just to not do bad things, right? You have to actively resist those bad things. So you start to see how this idea of prophetic critique of systems, not just individuals, and that it has to be done by everybody, right? Not just people who are priests or monks or pastors. You see how this starts to become a motivating feature of the abolitionist movement, of the anti-capitalist movement in the age of the robber barons, and so the social gospel movement, and then later on in the civil rights movement. So we see that trajectory. We also see it developing in the church as an alternative community. You start to see in the wake of lots of experiments in communal living. Now, let's be honest, many of those experiments fail, but these are people who are actively trying to engage in developing a way of life that can be a visible alternative to the society. Now, on the one hand, you have what ends up happening is they start to become too separatist. So, of course, in our society, we have Mennonites, we have Amish, right? These are people who are pacifists. They're refusing the economic system. They live in community, but they're not engaged in critique of society. They're anybody can join them, right? But they are a visible alternative. But they really are pretty insular. And that's one of the things that starts to happen. Is it enough to just be a visible alternative if you're not expressing why you're wanting to be a visible alternative, right? Because you don't want to be involved in systems of power. So we have those kinds of communities, the Hutterites, the Mennonites, the Amish, and things like that. But you also had all kinds of experimental communities, right? So there's a movie out right now about Ann Lee, the founder of the Shaker movement, and they had communities that existed for a long time. Just this past summer, I got to visit the Oneida community. So have people been to visit the Oneida? Oh, it's just a short bit away. It's so fascinating. So, and plus it's really beautiful. So just so fascinating. But the Oneida community and how now, obviously, a lot of these communities end up with problems, and typically around sexuality and things like that. That's why the Shakers were like, no sex. But the Oneida community,
Lots of sex.
yeah, we're just like, let's just all do it. It's all property. There's no rules. But is they are trying to become a visible community that is sharing everything economically, where that's a place and a space oftentimes where you saw more gender equality because they did not want to be involved in systems of power. Another example on the Catholic side might be the Catholic worker movement and their development of settlement houses to reach out to immigrants. And their whole idea, again, was living the gospel by providing hospitality, housing, food, and living among the poor, living with the poor, right? Living and sharing all things. And so, and Dorothy Day says, look, we're not trying to change the world. Right, we are doing what God has called us to do. We're not trying to change the world. We're trying to live the gospel, right? And we know that will change the world, right? That aim has to be living the gospel. So there were lots of ways. Those are just a few of the many, many examples. The ways in which Christians and Protestant Christians democratized this prophetic critique, right? It used to be the case, right, in the medieval period and in the Catholic Church, that's for the priests to do. The priests make the decisions. The monks make the decisions. Well, the Protestant Reformation gave the everyday Christian a new kind of priestly authority, but with that comes great responsibility, right? We can't just be like, oh, somebody else is going to be doing that. No, you are the priest. You are the one who is called to do that. So we see then prophetic Christianity taking the forms of speaking truth to power, transforming, offering critiques of unjust systems, and then also becoming an alternative community. And one of the things that I think is interesting is the extent to which complete withdrawal is seen to be a requirement of creating a Christian community. And it's been really hard for Christians over the years to practice that kind of radicality while also being fully engaged in society, right? To be in the world, but not of the world, right? A lot of these communities end up being separatist sects. And part of the reason for that is that lots of Christians don't enjoy radical reformist ideas, right? A lot of the critique comes internally from Christians. Back in the days of the radical reformers, they were killed by other Christians. They were persecuted by other Christians. And the reason is other Christians don't like the uncomfortable feeling that challenge creates for them, right? When you're faced with somebody who's willing to do more, willing to sacrifice more, that convicts you, right? And a response to that creates a kind of cognitive dissonance in you, right? Is often persecution, right? To say that, well, they're wrong, they're crazy, they've gone off the deep end, right? They're not normal Christians or something like that. And so radical reform groups and separatist groups, they've been critiqued internally by other Christians who wanted to kind of walk more of a lukewarm path. So there's been this kind of critique of them. So they end up becoming separatists. So I think that is one of the challenges for the church, is to think, how can we live as a visible alternative without becoming separatists? Is that possible? Like, how can we do that? And how can we support those, even if we don't feel like we have the ability to live that way? Then how can we support rather than deride those communities that do choose to live those kinds of radical ways? Okay, so confronting unjust systems, becoming a visible alternative society. Well, that brings us then to my sort of 20th century example of this, which is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I've given you like a little bio in case you don't know anything about him. So you've got that little mini bio. But I'm just going to be highlighting those aspects that lead to the kinds of activities that I'm talking about. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not born a radical. He was born into a relatively well-off, highly educated academic family. He was an intellect. His dad was a psychiatrist in Germany, quite famous. They were very cultured, very educated, well off. So they were perfectly fine, regular family, and they weren't particularly religious. He is clearly on a path to a brilliant academic career. He gets 2 PhDs by the time he's 24. He was interested in theology and was considered to be a kind of theological prodigy. And at this point, though, it's largely just intellectual. It's a set of theological problems to solve, right? He's just reading and writing articles. He's not doing anything. He's not living anything differently. He's just studying, he's reading, he's being an intellect. And later he says, I turned away from the phraseology of a theologian to the reality of living a Christian life. And the key point in his radicalization did not come in Germany, but it came in Harlem. He came to New York City and he was studying in New York City, and he ends up going to a church in Harlem. And he spent a year in New York, and in 1930-31 around, he spends at that time, and he goes to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, and he heard the preaching of a pastor there named Adam Clayton Powell. Mm-hmm. And he was fascinated by the content of their hymns, the Black spirituals, and he was fascinated essentially by, I don't know if they would have called it then, but it was essentially a form of liberation theology, basically speaking to the fact about human suffering and liberation, and that's what the gospel is speaking to. And he realized And it just felt really vibrant and exciting in the way that Black churches can, right? So just a lot of joy, but a lot of acknowledgement of the pain and suffering in life, and that the gospel is intended to speak to that. And so he starts to think about Christianity not so much as just an intellectual system, which is how he had always thought about it, kind of intellectual theology, but much more as a lived faith. How do you live your faith? And specifically, he felt he was finding that among an oppressed people, that they were living the gospel more clearly, more energetically, more enthusiastically than anybody that he knew. And so he started going to that church. He started writing down and collecting all the spirituals and things like that. And he later described his experience saying, quote, "Here in the Black church, one can truly speak and hear about sin and grace and the love of God as a reality, a transformative reality in people's lives, not just as kind of high level theology." And this radically changes him. And he says that he comes to believe that the church is only truly the church when it is explicitly standing with those who suffer. So he comes back to Germany, and in 1933, Hitler comes to power, and 2 days later, Bonhoeffer is on the radio. Bonhoeffer is on the radio giving a speech, basically saying this is a false prophet, this is a false leader, we should not be, this is a warning. People are treating him like an idol. They were already doing that in 1993, and he's cut off. The broadcast is cut off in the middle. Somebody flipped the switch right already in his very early days of 1933. And it's not known who cut it off, but maybe it was just the station agent who was worried, right? It's going to attract attention, the wrong kind of attention. And so he realizes what is going on, and he starts to work to create a visible alternative. Because what Hitler and the Nazis tried to do is they nationalized the German church, right? So they want to call it, the German Christian church. And this was going to be a church that was aligned with nationalism. So this was an issue, obviously. So Christian nationalism in Germany. It had to be purged of all Jewish influence, and this church was under the authority of the Fuhrer. It had to be obedient to the Fuhrer. So clearly not a church in which had the place or the space to be a prophetic church, right? Which means critiquing power, because one of the requirements is that you be obedient. And Bonhoeffer says, no, I'm not going to be part of this church. Quote, "The church has only one altar, and that altar is not the nation," right? Recall to mind, if you have way back when people are realizing with Ambrose, with Augustine, with the medieval reformers and theologians, if the church is aligned with national power, it loses its ability to critique that power, which is one of its central roles according to the gospel. So he gets together with a bunch of other like-minded Christians, and he, with others, writes the Barmen Declaration, which says, "Jesus Christ, as he is attested for us in Holy Scripture, is the one word of God which we have to hear," right? That's going to be our authority, sola scriptura, which we have to trust and obey in life and death. We reject the false doctrine that the church can recognize other sources of revelation, including political powers, right? So we are not going to be part of a church that has to be obedient to some other source of authority besides the church. We're not going to do that. So he and his friends start an alternative church and comes to be known as the Confessing Church. They start an alternative church, which is immediately outlawed. And they start a seminary, but it's immediately outlawed. And he goes and he starts an underground seminary. He and his compatriots fellow Christians start an underground seminary in a town called Finkenwald. And there, the members of this seminary, they're not only critiquing and making writings and critiquing the Fuhrer and doing all of those kinds of things. But they have also decided that they are going to create a seminary community that is along gospel principles. So here we have a figure who is doing two things. He sees his responsibility as explicitly critiquing power and refusing to be part of a Christian community that is in any way allied with nationalism, and certainly not this kind of nationalism, German nationalism, but any nationalism. And he also then at Finkenwald wants to create an alternative community. And they live together, they pray together, they confess their sins to one another, they share meals, and they practice economic simplicity and economic sharing of all goods. And he writes about this, and this comes to be called his book, Life Together. So if you're interested in reading about that experience there, you can read his book, Life Together. And it's in that book that he writes, the church is the church only when it exists for others. The church is not there to exist for you. It is that, right? You should always have this idea that it exists for others. I'm part of this, right? And so other people are going to be existing for you, but you need to be existing for others. So you see here, he's also trying to create an alternative community. He's refusing to allow his Christianity and his church to be co-opted for nationalism, explicitly speaking out against the co-optation of Christianity for nationalistic purposes, for the purposes of furthering or validating and valorizing Hitler's power, the nationalist power. So his most famous theological work develops then in the context of the rise of Nazism in the 30s. And this is a book that he writes called The Cost of Discipleship. And he writes, quote, cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross. And by there, I think he means grace without suffering, right? Christ suffered. So he says grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ. You know, Christianity has placed human suffering at the center. Now, Christ allows us to triumph over that human suffering, but human suffering, Christ's suffering, is at the center, and it's at the center of his preaching. So God wants to alleviate the suffering of other human beings, and it is cheap grace if you are just, well, I'm good, I'm fine, just like in the book of Revelation. Would that you were hot or cold, right? Would that you not be complacent? Would that you not be lukewarm? So he says, cheap grace is a religion that does not confront injustice. Costly grace is when Christ calls you, he bids you to come and die. So obviously he's in a dire circumstance of having been driven underground, being persecuted by the Nazis, and he's having to make a decision whether or not he's going to capitulate, whether or not he's going to go silent. I mean, this is a situation where he's being targeted. So what he's done his whole life is speaking and writing. And so he continues to speak, he continues to write, he continues to preach, and continues to remain faithful in this explicitly alternative Christian community. And he's not just doing it quietly, right? He's not being a separatist. He's not like, well, we're going to take our Jesus ball and go live by ourselves, right? He's not doing that, right? He's, while living as a visible alternative, he's engaging constantly in speaking truth as power, resisting injustice. And that he's not just, he realizes, in a way, talk is cheap. And here he's been writing about costly grace. So he actually starts to get involved. He starts actively helping Jews to escape from Germany. He becomes part of the Abwehr resistance circle that is seeking to assassinate Hitler. He participates eventually in a conspiracy against Hitler. And this is one of the most, people debate this, right? Think about the ethics of this, right? They basically say, well, then you're saying you're going to use violence, right? You're going to use violence if you're going to try to assassinate Hitler. Here you have this pacifist theologian who becomes involved in a plot to kill a tyrant. And fascinatingly, he says, responsible action for the sake of victims may require guilt. right? So you could say, well, but how, there's all sorts of theological and problems with that. Who gets to decide who's a tyrant worth assassinating, right? Those kinds of things. But his point is, these are unjust laws. These are, they're just because something's a law doesn't mean that it's just. We have all sorts of unjust laws on the books, right? This is not certain laws, unjust laws need to be resisted. And so he says the ultimate question for a responsible Christian is not how is he to extricate himself heroically from the situation, but how is the coming generation going to live? How, if you don't act, what's going to happen to people afterwards? How are you going to live? So he has an opportunity to be in the United States and to remain in safety, but he will not. He will not do that. He will not seek his own safety. He says, I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Right? It's not just enough to step aside. It's not just enough to not participate, right? You can't have the benefit when this is all over of reconstructing and being part of the reconstruction if you haven't engaged in the suffering, if you stayed out of the suffering. And so he is arrested. And this is this notion of costly grace. I have to put my money where my mouth is. I have to put my life where my mouth is. I have to live the gospel. So he's arrested in 1943, and in prison, he writes the letters that become letters and papers from prison. And those have been collected together, and those are a great read. And he says, the church is the church only when it exists for others, not dominating, but always helping and serving. Only the suffering God can help, right? Only a God who understands what it is to suffer, to be crushed under power, which is what happened to Jesus. He's crushed by Roman power. People are being crushed by secular powers in 1930s Germany. People are being crushed by power today. So it's only when we serve those people and help those people and join with them in that suffering, even though we could easily extricate ourselves. But are we willing to be on the lines that Christ is present and is there with the suffering? And so he eventually dies, obviously, in 1945, because he's put to death. He's executed in prison in Flossenburg, and there's a description of him by the camp doctor right before his execution at age 39. I saw Bonhoeffer kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to God. And in the almost 50 years that I've worked as a doctor got to see him, I've hardly ever seen a man so entirely submissive to the will of God. So Bonhoeffer basically shows us Revelation's refusal to worship empire, where Christians need to resist empire, the medieval call to confront power, the radical Reformation's alternative community development, or living in the church as if it's an alternative community, and the Reformed traditions of resistance to tyranny. So with him, the church becomes both a visible new society and an active force against unjust systems. So for him, prophetic responsibility and prophetic activism means action. It's taking responsibility and joining in voluntarily with the suffering of others in the very real conditions of history now. And so he says, silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. And when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. And the church is the church only when it exists for others. So I think he is a powerful, powerful example of a kind of culmination of these two trends within the Christian notion of prophetic responsibility, which goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible. You have to critique power, you have to critique unjust systems, and you have to live visibly, explicitly, in a way that is clearly distinct from the unjust systems of power, violence, wealth hoarding that dominate society. So I was writing all of this and thinking about all of this for you guys. And of course, I've been thinking about this. And I don't know how many of you watched Colbert or Upright. So are people aware about what happened with Colbert, the FCC? Mm-hmm. Right. So some of you are aware. So James Tallarico, who I guess is a candidate for Senate for Texas, he was going to be on the Colbert show. And I've seen lots of little videos of him. He's very explicitly Christian and he's been a great voice. And he is a ninth generation Texan. He has tons of like Baptist preachers in his past. And he looks so straight edge. He looks so much like a banker or something like that. And yet he is speaking radical prophetic truth. And what ended up happening was Colbert wanted to have him on, and I guess there's the new CBS, which is all under new leadership, has been making all these moves to censor, right, late night talk shows and shut them down, et cetera, and to censor various different things. And so when they heard that they were having James Tallarico, who is making extraordinary strides for Democrats in Texas, the head of CBS said, well, you can't have him on. You can't. They were trying to censor him. And he says, never in my whole career have I been told you can't have somebody on. And they were doing it in order to lay claim to the fact that saying, well, the equal time rule, that if you have one from one party, you have to have one from another party. But historically, there's always been an exception to that for entertainment shows, right? That's for like news shows, or if Monroe County's holding a debate, they can't just only have the Democratic candidates, that kind of thing. So they're invoking this never before invoked rule, in which there actually is a written exception for late night talk shows, but in order to make it so that Tallarico won't be on television. But in the of course, it brought more attention to it because Colbert explained that. They taped it and they put it on YouTube. And I suggest that you go watch it, this video, which is only on YouTube now, of Colbert interviewing, because this is an example of prophetic critique. He is talking about, yes.
He's a Presbyterian seminarian.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Mentioned that. So he is speaking truth to power. And one of the things that Colbert asked him about was he says, well, you're very vocal about the separation of church and state. Recall to mind that we talked about this, that in the case of Ambrose, in the case of Augustine, that they recognized, and Tallarico says, yes, you have to be separate, not to protect not because of the state, although that's good. We don't want the state telling us who we can worship and not worship, right? That's originally why we have it in there. But it protects the church so that the church can be an independent entity that's not allied with nationalist power, so it can critique. And he articulates this very well. And so I'm just going to read, this is, I found the transcript of it. And he says, this is why I fought so hard for the sacred separation in our First Amendment, because my granddaddy raised me to believe that the boundary between church and state doesn't just benefit the state or our democracy, although it certainly does, but it also benefits the church. Because when the church gets too cozy with political power, it loses its prophetic voice. He's bringing this language into public discourse, and I was thrilled. Its ability loses its prophetic voice. It loses its ability to speak truth to power, its ability to imagine a completely different world. And so the separation between church and state is something we have to safeguard. It's something that we have to fight for. And I think we need someone in the US Senate who's going to confront Christian nationalism and tell the truth that there is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism. It is the worship of power in the name of Christ, and that is a betrayal of Jesus. So yes, there is nothing Christian about Christian nationalism, and the entire history of the church's development theologically in all these different ways of the notion of prophetic responsibility sees that time and time again, that nationalist movements are antithetical to the gospel. So this whole push towards Christian nationalism is not just anti-American. The point is that it's anti-Christian, because then, right, we want a church that can critique systems of power. We want a church that can critique unjust economic systems and shows a vibrant, loving, inclusive community that is visible and visibly opposed to all of those things. So I think Third Press is such a community, but we're always called upon to do more, me included. So I hope that's giving you some food for thought.
Oh,
The view also.
Right,
Yeah.
you know, which is just obviously an attempt to use state power to shut down speech, right? So I talk to my students all the time because I think that they don't, I don't want them to grow up thinking this is normal, but also just to get them to see the connection. So for example, there's been all sorts of attempts, like right now, they're trying to, I just saw an interview with JD Vance, where basically they're trying to criminalize protests, right? They're trying to criminalize protests. And so when I'm teaching in my class, I point out different times, for example, in the ancient Roman world, where they criminalize, for example, under Herod, more than 3 adult men, Jewish men walking around together. And I try to say to my students, like, why do you think that is? Right. And it's fascinating to me to see who can instantly see why, and who's just like, I don't know, why would they do that? Right. Because they don't want like-minded people getting together and saying, like, this is baloney. Like, why, you know, and be a resistance movement, resisting power. That's why we have enshrined in our Constitution the free right to assemble. Right, as well as free speech. You can't censor us, right? This is when it becomes fundamentally important. And we're just seeing all these censorship attempts all over the place. So the irony, of course, is now this has more views than it ever would have gotten.
Yeah.
Right? It has like 8 million views already. So it has more views than it ever would have gotten. But you know, these are the kinds of things that we need to resist, not as just illegal and anti-American, but as anti-Christian. You know, the public discourse around Christianity in this country, we have very loud, shrill voices. And I think that people who are drawn to the kinds of prophetic Christianity and to seize Christianity as a way to serve and be in community with people and to be, right, we tend to be a quieter people. You know, we're not as shrill, right? We're just sort of, and I just am excited. I don't know that much more about somebody like James Tallarico, but him and Pete Buttigieg, who are actively showing a form of Christianity that is not about power, that is not about ambition, that is not about trying to marry Christianity with any form of nationalism. German nationalism in the 1930s, American nationalism today. We have a class that's taught in our department by religious studies professors in political, but it's crossless in political science, on religious nationalism. And every year, I mean, it is full. Like, kids are nervous, right, about the rise of religious nationalism in our country and how to deal with it and how to speak to it. And this notion, this weird notion that has come in, which is so, in my mind, so anti-Christian, right? That somehow being American, you know, the flag and the cross and those things together. No. That it's somehow, you know, that's just such a wrong notion, but somehow that has come into our culture in a deeply problematic way.
I just wanted to, I'm a big Dorothy Day fan.
Yes.
And, you know, she was in Rochester for a little while, many moons ago.
Mhm.
And the other thing about her that's so interesting is that she was political.
Yeah.
And she was against nukes, she was against World War II, she was a pacifist,
Mhm.
and she worked with Cesar Chavez.
Yes.
So she did both, but sure. It was-
My elementary school, Cesar Chavez Elementary School, is right, I can jump the fence and get to, right, my hometown. Yeah, because California. Well, I think that, I think I didn't quote it, and I think this quote is hers, where she says, it's not enough to just bandage the victims who are caught under the wheel of injustice, right? We've got to jam the wheel, right? She was also realizing that it's about systems, not necessarily, individuals or, yes, we should be bandaging the victims, but we need to break the system, break the wheel that has created so many victims. There's a hand. Ann?
I just want to say I learned so much
Ah.
every single time.
Yeah.
How is Bonhoeffer beheld in Germany today?
Oh, I think as a hero, as a national hero, for sure.
So
Yes, very, very much so. And of course, I mean, I was introduced to his work in, obviously at Harvard. And very much considered a kind of, a kind of modern saint, being willing to. And his work is really, I think his work is, I don't know about that, but his work is really, I'm sure there are statues and things like that, or in Finkenwald, and, I would love to maybe go to Finkenwald, but. So I don't really know about how Germans celebrate him, but he is clearly celebrated. And of course he, was interacting with people like Karl Barth and with other, with other theologians at the time as well. There was Christian resistance to the Nazi regime, and that Christian resistance took the form of public resistance. Right? Even though if you're getting cut off and censored and have to go underground, like but also in activism, actively hiding people, actively saving people, just like I think people are doing now. Actively warning when ICE is here, actively warning when, when you're trying to take people away and destroy families and disrupt lives, people need to act. And I think people are acting. I mean, I think the city of Minneapolis is doing an extraordinary job. And I think, I know it's been made into a kind of a funny meme, but I thought it was so poignant. I'm sure you've seen that image of that woman in her bathrobe. Have you seen that image? It's just a woman who saw this was going on and her neighbors were being stolen. And she's just looks like a middle-aged lady, which she is, right? And she's out in her kind of plush teal bathrobe and matching foam slippers, and she's out there and she's just like, outraged. And, this is not somebody you would think of as some sort, and fighting back against camo. Yeah, look it up. It's a great image. And that is what resistance means, is getting out there in your bathrobe.
Martin Luther King lost a lot of his
Yeah.
respect when he decided to speak out against the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And most of us want to be good, but
Yeah.
we are not radical.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard for us to know how to do it best. Obviously, the protests in Minneapolis did work.
Yeah. Yeah, it did. And so I think, right. I mean, obviously, these are ideals. These are, just like we were talking last week about hoarding wealth and, things like that and how we think about that. And of course, to some extent, I'm hoarding wealth. I want, but I just try to add my light to the sum of light. That is my motto. I also think that Christ does not call, Christ, what are the gifts that you have? Maybe you're not somebody who can be on the front lines, but you can support those people. You can knit hats. Who's the woman who's knitting hats? I don't think she's here today.
She's online.
Oh, yeah. She's online.
Right. You can, there's all sorts of things that you can do. There's all sorts of things that you do. With the main, I think one of the main things being speaking out, right? That whole thing about, that they've done, having nothing to do with these kinds of topics, but just the studies that they've done on bystanders, and like the real thing is just one person needs to say something and be brave enough and others will follow. But we also need to be brave enough to follow, right? So if we don't feel like we're the brave to support those people who do have the skills, the abilities, the life circumstances, whatever, to be on the front lines, well, you can also support the front lines. You can also do that. So there's all kinds of ways I think that people can contribute. But right now, I think from a Christian perspective, I want there to be more James Talarico's, who are basically saying this is not, Christian nationalism is not Christianity. Christian, this, talk about Christian, this is not Christian. There was just, I don't know if you saw, I can't keep up. And sometimes like to just, my own spirit, it's hard I find it, I don't want to project and say it's hard. It's hard for me to maintain a balance between being informed and not being depressed. So, right, because then I'm not any good to anybody. But I just saw this, it's an insane thing about this guy. Why is he getting all this time in front of Congress? But it was this guy talking about how white Christian culture is being destroyed in America. And luckily all the senators were like, give me a single example. And they couldn't give a single example. Well, generally, it's just like, oh my God. But just to, those are being heard in Congress. Like, what the heck? So, I think that people speaking out, but in a way speaking out saying, because this is what Christianity is, right? We've allowed people, not we, but, we've allowed in this country for a weird discourse about the nature of Christianity to be so warped in our public discourse. And I think it's doing harm not only to our democracy, but I think it's doing harm to our own communities because the youth of today are not going to want to be part of that church, right? The youth of today are remarkable and they are there. They're very activated. They're very for the downtrodden and the marginalized in all sorts of ways. And I feel like saying you have a home in the church. That's where you're going to find communities actively working to alleviate suffering. Mm-hmm. As he says, you have to be in there constantly working to alleviate suffering. Christ suffered. He put suffering at the center of the gospel. That's at the center of our message. And so we are here to alleviate it. But if we constantly have only this drumbeat of Christian nationalism and power with examples of wealth hoarding and coercive use of power, of course, they're not going to want to be part of that. If we don't see churches that are visible alternatives to them, visible alternatives. So that I think is the challenge in the current time. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. I read some stuff when the new Pope came in.
Yeah.
That he was doing at least he was talking a lot about not having the Catholic Church hold the money and the power and everything, but it's for the people. I've sort of lost track of all that with all the other
stuff
crap
that's going on. Yeah.
I
have hopes for him. I have hopes for the new, I'm not Catholic, I'm not invested in the Pope, but, as somebody who can influence, world Christianity and American Catholicism, I think that, that is good. I think he's a good continuation of Francis, moving towards, lots of care for the immigrants, lots of care, so I appreciate that. And maybe Americans will hear it more because it's in English.
I know that was less, but I just wanted to ask, that we keep kind of circling around this. Do you have any examples of people, modern day leaders who are like Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day, who will be the voice for us? Like, I'm racking my brain. It seems like the Democratic Party just seems to have slipped through the cracks. No one.
Right. I think, say again.
Reverend Barber.
Oh, yeah, William Barber.
Yeah.
I'm just looking for people to follow.
But he's more national. He's not, right, because we don't really, there's not a nationalist prophetic voice, right? That's the thing. People listen to prophetic voices. Yeah. Martin Luther King was a prophetic voice. Malcolm X was a prophetic voice. These are people who can, partly, to some extent, we've over democratized voices where everybody's on the internet. And so there's a little too much democracy in that, so that in a way we can't have a singular sort of, there's all these voices of young people, but you don't have a single person. And and the other thing is that I've seen a lot of things, and I know that a lot just from my kids, they watch a lot of these weird adversarial things where it's basically a right winger and a left winger or whatever, and they're debating topics and doing gotchas and stuff like that.
Like Charlie Kirk.
That's right, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But even Democrats are falling
Yeah.
into doing that, on the other side, trying to convince people. And I just don't think that's that effective, to be honest. These people did not get to the people who they did not get you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason their way into, right? These are not reasonable positions that are being held. They need alternative, prophetic voice, right? That is out there, that is that's why, those are so charismatic, right? So we need somebody with that level of charisma, somebody who's not seeking power,
Right.
Martin Luther was not seeking office. I mean, James Tallarico, Pete Buttigieg, there are lots of people who are in office who are speaking against, but not, and they're using the language of Christianity. But I don't see anybody out right now. I don't see very many people who are speaking truth to power from a position of prophetic Christianity, who are outside of power. Because Tallarico, he is still seeking power, which is great. We want people like him to be in power. But I think you're right. Who can we follow?
Heather Cox Richardson, she's a historian.
Yes, Heather.
Oh, of
course, exactly.
It's not Christianity, but it's a voice that's kind of making people aware
Yeah. And I mentioned before, what got me through the pandemic was Jacinda Ardern, frankly, and her leading with compassion and empathy. And I met Jacinda Ardern. She was and she's, writing a lot about how you can be in a position of power to serve others. She uses that language. And she talks about how she doesn't have personal ambition, right? She wanted to she loves New Zealand. She went to work for New Zealand. I mean, she's, absolutely wonderful, but she's written some good books on that. And she is a very charismatic speaker. When she's so watching so first of all, she's not speaking to these issues. She has specific issues she's speaking to, and she's a New Zealander, so she's interested in New Zealand. But I think the way that she articulates her message and is consistent about, the downfalls of power and seeking power and that once you are interested in power, you're not going to change the system. Because that system is giving you that power, right? So that's why you have to be people outside of the power system. And you can see that frankly at every level. At the university level, it's so funny because we've got all like faculty and faculty grumble and this and that or whatever. And then, one of your friends becomes an administrator and all of a sudden they're talking dean speak and you're like, oh my gosh, it's been co-opted, you know what I mean? But partly it's because now they're in the systems of power, right? And so I would just love to have a dean who, I love the deans at U of R and they've been nothing but good to me. But, and now I'm old enough that all the people who are currently deans at U of R are all good friends of mine, but to some extent they do, power changes you, even a little tiny bit of power like that.
Well, I hope we have the power to bring you back a year from now. Thank you so much.
You better watch out, he'll make you a dean.